Today, I wanted to talk about a kind of structural aspect that I saw when watching the movie When Harry Met Sally. And again, what I mean by structural aspect is kind of just are the characters together? Are they apart? How does that work within the story, and what makes it, what helps basically back up this idea of the romance, essentially? Because, is it better to have your characters together or apart when you're trying to tell a romance? Is it better to have this, that, and the other, and kind of see from there? And this is what I was kind of noticing and kind of thinking about romances in general and how to make them work, just in terms of a structural and how they kind of tend to be organized. And other things, my wife watched a bunch of Hallmark romances, and I was kind of noticing a similar pattern from them. And it's kind of interesting just to see how it all plays out. Because again, there's a reason why these stereotypes are continually and constantly repeated. The reason why is because they work, and that's what we kind of wanted to talk about. So usually this part is pretty straightforward. What you have the two characters, and they are apart, basically. And what this does is it gives you a time to see what they're like alone, more or less, or alone that. Now, this can be slightly played on because the apart section could be not necessarily that they're alone, but they're with someone else. That's how a lot of romances can start, is where it's basically a breakup. I think I was watching No Strings Attached, or one of those other silly ones, but basically it starts off with both of the main characters breaking up or getting broken up with their significant other, basically. So alone, or more, we'll just call it apart, the apart section. So we get to see what the characters are like apart, more or less. And then they go from there, and then there's this section where they cross paths. So basically you get to see these two characters from separate lives and everything. They cross paths, and then bam, we get to see what they are like. We get a glimpse, a hint of what they're like together from there. And then once, they cross back, and then they go back to being apart. And it kind of just give you, again, you're kind of teasing this whole thing out. And then usually that can happen again. Usually maybe one or two times. It felt like the Hallmarks would continually tease this almost together. No, almost together. No, almost together. Anything like that. But either way. So after the cross paths, then you have this idea. Usually what happens is they are now together as friends. This is how a lot of modern romances do this, kind of exploring the friendship between men and women, platonically or potentially platonically, because you're waiting to see, because basically what you're doing is the scale is moving, the goalpost is moving. So, step one, you want the characters to get together. And then step two, once they're finally together, you realize, no, I'm actually not satisfied with that. I actually want them to be together, to get together as a romance. And then once that happens, then you want them to get together happily, and be, after the romance, you want them to be happy together, happily ever after from there. And so that's kind of continually this moving goalpost. So once they're together as friends, usually this part, and this is where it kind of fluctuates from there, but usually there's a together as friends. And then there is usually a moment where it builds, where they cross that line from friendship into romance or lovers. They go into the romance spectrum. And then here, usually then once they cross into romance, oftentimes it splits up and they go back to being apart. Again, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to tease the audience by getting exactly as close to what they want from there as they could possibly go, and then pull back. As close as they want, and then pull back. As close, and pull back. And then basically now, though, what's happened is we got used to them being friends, and we enjoyed that, but now we basically have started over from the beginning. We went up 2 steps, and we went back 3 steps, basically. So now the audience is like, oh dear. Now, what the audience now has to happen is the situation's gotten even worse than it was, in the second portion. The first portion, they're completely apart. The second portion, they're together as friends. Third portion, they're together as romance. And then fourth, they're back apart. So now we got to figure out what happens next. Again, I've said a few times, that's the most important part. So long as the audience wants to know what happens next, you're doing good. You're doing good, because then they're willing to go with you. The second they are not, then they're bored and they've stopped watching, and then it's kind of story time over. So then they break apart from there, and then we're waiting for some sort of reconciliation, more or less, because now they're apart. This can be an extended period apart. Sometimes it's one of those where they break up, and then fast forward 5 years, or fast forward of one relationship. Someone's married somebody else, got divorced, you on and off relationships. Now you're back together 5 years later, or something like that. That could happen basically from there. And then after the apart, then eventually, though, you have the culmination and the kind of the finale for most movies, the finale and culmination where they come together and then they kind of solidify they are together as a couple, or together in romance, more or less. So they're finally together and they're completely one, unified, and there. And then that's where most stories end. And then at that point, you move on to the happily ever after, basically, phase from there. And yeah, I think that's the whole kind of basically, that more or less covers kind of the structural aspect for a lot of romances. Because I was thinking that's kind of how a lot of Hallmarks work, but basically what it is this kind of, you're building the audience up to like a little section at a time, more or less. So it's like, let's start off with, and basically if you're starting the story off, the audience off, you want to get the audience to wish for a happily ever after. Basically, that's what you want them to do. But you can't just start there, because they're just like, you have to get them invested in the relationship. Everybody says that, but what does that actually mean? What that means is, step 1, we get them to like character A. Step 2, like character B. Step 3, enjoy, character A and B and their journeys apart. And once you can get them to care about character A and B, and then you have them cross paths, and then the audience starts to go, what if they were together? And you can kind of show this. And oftentimes what you'll do is you can have a decent amount of contrast, because what you do is you have the best part of the movie or the show or the play or whatever are when the characters are together. Their chemistry and everything like that, their dynamics, so the audience knows they're better together. They're happier, it's more fun, they're more enjoyable, the story's better, all this. And then the audience starts to get pulled in. But basically then, as they get pulled in, they've just crossed paths, so they're not together yet. So it's like, okay, so then the audience is now pushing for them to be together as friends, the level 1, basically. Once they're together as friends, you can kind of see where that begins to go, and you can build on that, build on that, build on that. And then you realize you're hoping that they go to the next level from there. You want them to be, romantically involved from there. And then once they're romantically involved, then bam, you break it off. And that's the important part, is because once you break it off at that point, now the audience really wants to know what's going to happen next. Because now what happens is, before, when you don't care about the characters or care about the relationships, when they break it off, you just don't care. Exactly that. Same as you may have guessed. But now we really want to see what's happening, because now we're fully invested. We're bought into this. And now we've got to see this ship turn around. If you watch a shipwreck, if you don't care if the ship actually gets rescued or if it makes it out of this dangerous situation. But if you make somebody care about the ship, and then the ship gets into danger, now they're really invested to see that ship make it out, make it to shore, basically, at that point. Even if making it to shore take hours, something like that. You're basically investing the audience, and then disaster. You don't disaster and then invest the audience, really. You basically have to kind of pull them in and get them invested, in order for then, when you cause bad things to happen to your characters, then they can care about what happens next from there. And then basically again, and then usually as together as romance, you break it apart, and then they're apart, and you're kind of reminded for all the reasons why that they're better together. Kind of, it's even more painful, and the kind of the echoes of the fact that they should be together and should be in a relationship together kind of come back and play in that role. And then you have that, and then of course, then you have that final culmination, that final moment where, bam, they come back together and they're solidifying their relationship. They're kind of moving on to the next stage, and then that leads into the happily ever after. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this one. Just a little short one talking about this and kind of just the romantic aspects and kind of stories in general for it. So watch it in the next romance movie you see, and kind of see if this whole aspect plays out, because this is definitely not the only way to write romances. A lot of times there's some really great stories that really play on doing this and playing with this a lot, and kind of doing something completely different compared to other stories. Some of them don't, but there you have it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I will see you in the next one.